My presentation is on the economic impact, particularly on unemployment, of the COVID-19 mitigation policies, in particular the so-called lockdown in the spring and early part of the summer in Great Britain. The issues from an economic point of view, particularly in relation to Britain coming into the pandemic, the economic issues, were first of all the UK as a whole had a geographically uneven economy, sometimes referred to as the North-South divide, before the pandemic. Since the last global global financial crisis and the last Great Recession, in the UK, as in many other developed economies, productivity and real wage growth has really stagnated since then. In the UK, employment growth has been strongest in low wage and low productivity sectors, e.g. personal services, leisure and hospitality, which have also been particularly badly affected by measures to control the spread of coronavirus. The declining retail on the so-called traditional high street and town centres has been a problem in recent years in the UK and has been of great political concern. And of course, specifically in relation to the UK context, we have at the present time great economic uncertainty surrounding Brexit. So in all, coming into the coronavirus pandemic, many local economies were fragile before it started. So the national lockdown in the UK throughout April and May at its strongest. Of course, since then there have been still considerable restrictions on social mixing of households and certain proximity between people in different economic and other venues. But the first full lockdown was April and May 2020, when all non-essential activities and travel in the UK and in and out of the UK were forbidden. Employees were required to work from home if possible, but many businesses were forced to shut down or severely curtail activities because of social distancing requirements. There was a major mitigation policy put in place, economic mitigation policy, called the COVID-19 Job Retention Scheme, which basically paid 80% of wages and all employer insurance and pension contributions of so-called furloughed workers. That's those who still had a job but were unable to work. The concept of local and regional economic resilience I'm using in the analysis that I will present. This is resilience is an area that has been used a lot in recent years to better understand all sorts of environmental and economic issues. In relation to economic issues, particularly local and regional economic growth and development, the focus has been on the ability of local and regional economies to resist and then subsequently recover from recessionary shocks. Key concepts in the regional economic resilience literature are path dependency and lock-in. So the trajectory of growth or economic evolution more generally that a local or regional economy was going through is seen to have an effect and to shape how it will respond to a particular shock and how it will continue to evolve moving forward. Sort of more negatively, there is often so-called lock-in of institutions and policies and ways of thinking that can lock a local or regional economy into low growth paths, or indeed sometimes higher growth paths. More positively, there is potential for transformation, which can be positive but also negative. So when there is a recessionary shock, a system will transform itself as it adapts to that shock. Issues with resilience approach to understanding local and regional economies are, firstly, there's an underlying assumption of a return to a normal or equilibrium state after an exogenous recessionary shock, which may or may not be an accurate way of looking at how economies evolve. Resilience literatures in more recent years are increasingly turning from the notion of recovery following a shock to broader processes of adaptation or even transformation. There are also questions in the regional economic literature about whether or not a recessionary shock itself is actually truly exogenous, or whether or not it is actually part and parcel of underlying economic weaknesses in the system in the first place. However, the COVID-19 lockdown, of course, can be seen almost entirely, if not entirely, as an exogenous shock to the economy. So, looking at some of the contextual evidence, what is the impact on unemployment? This time series chart shows the black line total unemployment numbers unemployed on the so-called claimant count, that is people receiving state benefits for reasons of unemployment. And the blue dotted line is the monthly increase or rate of change, percentage change on the previous month. Here I've pulled out the figures for April every year going back to 1972. The most recent is April 2020, which is the first full month of the COVID lockdown in the UK. Looking at the blue dotted line, you can see that April was, by an enormous margin, the single largest percentage increase in unemployment ever recorded in the UK. The black line shows the total numbers unemployed, still a bit lower than the peaks of the 1980s and early 1990s linked with deindustrialization. This chart is for April, and the analysis of the geography of the impact I'm going to present is for the increase in April. The first data to become available were for that month, the first month of the lockdown. So the black line here relates to April. Since undertaking the geographical analysis and producing that chart, I have looked at subsequent monthly data for numbers unemployed. They have remained on a total of over 2.5 million people at the time of presenting this in December. The latest figures currently are for October. Figures are still over 2.5 million. In May, they reached 2.7 million. That was the peak following the end of the first full lockdown. So that increase between March and May nationally from 1.2 million to 2.7 million, considerably more than doubling, an increase from 3% to 6.4% of all persons of working age, aged 16 to 64. So in other words, nearly 3.5, out of every 100 people of working age in a 2-month period moved onto state benefits for reasons of unemployment. Interestingly, the official ILO, or International Labour Office, definition of unemployment barely rose in these months. It has risen slightly since, and that's because the official definition of unemployment requires people to be searching for work. Job search seems to have collapsed because hiring had also collapsed, so there wasn't terribly much point in people in these early months searching for work. So here's the local impact. This map shows the percentage points increase from March to April when I did this analysis across local authority districts and so-called unitary authorities across the UK. You can see that the national increase in April was from 3 to 5.1% of working age, but that varies enormously from under 1 percentage point increase in affluent rural areas in the southeast of England up to well over 3, and in the case of Blackpool in the northwest, even over 5 percentage points increase in a single month. So there's a distinct geography to the increase of unemployment during the first month of the lockdown, and that's principally what I seek to explain and understand in this analysis. particularly testing two key hypotheses. The first one being that areas already susceptible to unemployment are vulnerable to the largest increases in unemployment during the lockdown. And hypothesis two, that local authority areas, local economies with greater shares of employment in sectors such as retail and hospitality and tourism that are most affected by the lockdown will display the greatest rises in unemployment. So to test these hypotheses, I assembled a data set for all of these 370 odd local areas. The susceptibility to unemployment was measured by the pre-COVID Office for National Statistics claimant unemployment rate for March 2020. The share of employment in lockdown sectors was defined using a study from Joyce and Zhu 2020 at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who defined the most affected sectors as listed there. These data I extracted from the Office for National Statistics Workplace-Based Business and Business Register and Employment Survey for 2019. A large number of control variables in models were included, other things that would be expected from existing literature to affect the increase in unemployment. So the percentage of the workforce with high skills, defined based on qualifications, percentage of the workforce with low skills, based on having no qualifications. The path dependency notion was captured using the pre-lockdown unemployment trend in the 3 months leading up to March, when trends in unemployment were fairly stable nationally, although with some local variation, of course. Sectoral specialisation or diversity, both of which have been linked to economic resilience and productivity. And the employment growth rate in the 3 years prior to the lockdown, economic productivity measured by GVA per hour worked and GVA per job, and productivity growth in those measures. And finally, a region dummy variable to capture region level effects using the 11 Great Britain regions shown in this map. So these were coded 0 or 1 for each local authority area, depending on which region they were in. Northern Ireland is not in the model results because not all of the data required were available at local authority level for local authorities within Northern Ireland. The method of analysis was firstly to undertake 2 simple bivariate linear regressions to look at the relationships of the susceptibility to unemployment and the exposure to lockdown sectors in the economy, so hypotheses 1 and 2, looking at the simple bivariate linear relationships between these 2 measures and the percentage points increase in unemployment March to April, which is the dependent variable. I then went on to specify 3 different multivariate models. Firstly, putting together in one model the susceptibility and exposure measures, and then in multivariate model 2, adding in the skills measures, low skills and high skills, and also the path dependency, that is the trend in unemployment rate prior to the lockdown as controls. And then the final model specification, multivariate model 3, used a stepwise procedure, putting in all those control variables I listed a moment ago. So here we see the first of the simple bivariate relationships, this time for hypothesis 1. So this shows on the x-axis claimant unemployment in March 2020 prior to the lockdown, plotted against on the vertical y-axis the change in unemployment, our dependent variable, change in claimant unemployment between March and April. And we can see here a relatively strong relationship. There's a R square of 0.36, so this explains 36% of the local variation in the amount of increase in unemployment. And the gradient of the line is 0.263, so in other words, for every percentage point of unemployment in March, we would expect an increase of 0.263 percentage points in the following month. The outliers above the line tend to be remoter, rural and areas, particularly in the west coast of Britain, with large tourism sectors, and the outliers under the line tend to be either former industrial areas such as Nottingham, Inverclyde, Copeland and Birmingham, or very high productivity, high tech economies like Cambridge, South Cambridgeshire and Kingston upon Thames, being an affluent outer part of London. Turning now to hypothesis 2, here we do the same thing but plotting on the horizontal x-axis the percentage of employment in these locked down sectors. And here we see a relationship, but a much weaker relationship compared to hypothesis 1. So one of the key take-home messages from this analysis is that it is local economies that were most susceptible to unemployment before the lockdown that have suffered the most. The exposure to specific sectors most affected by the lockdown is a less important factor. So now turning to the model results. This is model 1 that puts together in a multivariate model these susceptibility for hypothesis 1 and exposure hypothesis 2 measures. And in the multivariate model we can see the same thing. Susceptibility is much more important than exposure. Now to model 2, we keep in the susceptibility and exposure measures and add in high skills, low skills and path dependency. Only high skills, that's the percentage of the workforce with a degree, is significant and has, as we would expect, a protective effect. So the higher the proportion of the workforce with a degree, the smaller the increase in unemployment. The proportion with low skills and path dependency, that is the pre-lockdown trend in unemployment, are both not statistically significant. Finally, model 3 is the stepwise procedure, throwing in all the controls. These are the variables that are retained by the stepwise procedure in the final model specification. And once again, the standardized beta coefficients for susceptibility and exposure relating to hypotheses 1 and 2 remain largely unchanged, with susceptibility much more important than exposure. High skills still has a protective effect. A few other variables come into this final model specification. Particularly important are some regional effects. So the reference category is the rest of Great Britain. So the east portion of England has a small protective effect, other things being equal, at district level within the east. Whereas Wales, the southwest and the northwest, so that's really most of Britain's west coast, show higher than otherwise predicted based on district level characteristics. These west coast regions show higher than predicted increases in unemployment, which is likely to be linked to region-wide dependence on the visitor economy and some of those locked down sectors, so stronger embedded supply chains and so on, so larger knock-on effects beyond the immediately affected sectors. So conclusions then from this analysis. A number of important policy issues become evident. Firstly, tackling geographical economic unevenness is important to build resilience to exogenous shocks. Secondly, and related to the first point, taking local concentrations of unemployment seriously is important, not just for its own sake, but for building resilience. Thirdly, reducing region-wide dependence on the visitor economy will also help build local and regional economic resilience. In terms of COVID-related policies, blanket lockdowns, such as have been used now twice in the UK, should be a last resort in controlling a pandemic because of the economic damage and subsequent social and indeed health damage that will come from this. So other measures such as track and trace, if can be made effective, will obviously be much less economically damaging. In terms of future research, I have looked at claimant unemployment because it was the first local data to become available on the impact of the lockdown. Subsequently, data on earnings, the impact on earnings, will become available, and this will be important to look at, as well as other economic indicators such as business death rates and so on. And lastly, we need future research, of course, on the longer term recovery and adaptation phase following the lockdowns as vaccines and other control measures get used in their place. Thank you for your attention.